Alright, so moving on to our glue up. It's a very product intensive process because you want to have everything ready to go. This is just the way I like to set up my workstation. I use wax paper because epoxy just typically won't stick to wax paper and is better than getting big globs of it all over your workbench. I went ahead and pre-sanded. You want to score up the surface of everything you're going to glue. Now use some 150 grit, 120 grit, but score up the surface of the knife, surface of the scales that you're going to glue together. And after that, we're going to wipe everything down with acetone just to make sure one last time that any residues or oils that may be present on there are gone. That way the glue isn't interfered with anything. Alright, now that we're wiped down, moving on. We got a couple of clamps. You're going to need those to hold it together after it's glued up. Several small rags that are disposable because whenever you're wiping this glue up, you're not going to want to wash these rags. Just use small ones, wipe it up, chunk it. I use syringes to pull up my epoxy. Makes it a lot easier to measure. You can go down to the pharmacy, get these for a couple bucks, or drop by your local fire station. They might even give you a few if you ask nicely. Acetone, of course, as with every other step of the process. The epoxy I use is the West Systems G-Flex. Now, a lot of people use the Acra glass. I've heard of people using Gorilla Glue. Never tried that myself. G-Flex never purely hardens. It always has some residual flex to it, which is a good characteristic for a knife because if you drop it, you want the glue to have some flex to it so that that scale doesn't shear back off if you drop it. And of course, a little measuring cup, mixing spoon. I go to Taco Cabana and grab these cups every time I eat there. Get the little spoons from your local, or sticks from your local coffee house. No reason to spend any money on those kind of supplies. And for one knife handle, I'm going to use combined about 10 cc's of epoxy, so 5 cc's of the hardener, 5 cc's of the resin, and that should give me plenty to do this knife. So from there, surfaces are prepped. Use your little bucket, squirt it in, give it a good mix. Make sure it's thoroughly mixed because you don't want any parts that are going to not cure properly. So this stuff isn't going to set extraordinarily fast. Take your time, get a good mix on it, make sure everything's blended. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do with the epoxy, I'm going to paint it on to the scale. Now, you'd be kind of inclined to just pour it in, but that'd be wasteful and you'd use way more epoxy than you need to. But just use a little stick, paint it on there. A thin layer is all you need because even with that thin layer, you're going to squeeze out a lot of it. Really, 10 cc's of epoxy is a lot. Alright, so that side's lathered up. Then I'm going to take my pins. I'm going to just dip the tip of the pin in the epoxy, get a little bit on there. I'm just going to kind of work it down into the scale. And make sure you get a nice even coat around the pin. Drop the knife in there, then I'll go ahead and lather up my other scale. So that's nice and lathered up. With the remainder of this stuff, I'm going to start dropping it down into all these holes that are in the knife handle. Get all those nice and filled up, and you're ready to throw the other scale on there. That's a good sign when you get the pins pushed through and you got a big bubble of glue on top of each of the pin. That means each of the pins had enough glue on it to really lace itself through that top scale. So now go ahead and give yourself just a quick once over cleanup. I don't like using exam gloves when I'm doing this, just because I prefer to have the finger sensation and dexterity. Nothing wrong with doing it that way if it works for you, but I've found that when I'm epoxying with those gloves on, if I get a little bit on one of the gloves, it just turns into a freaking nightmare. So I'd rather avoid it altogether. Alright, now we're going to set our pins. Make sure it's about halfway through each side. So you can see there down the profile we got good protrusion on each side. So we're going to move on to clamping it up. Now when you're clamping these, you don't want to put it too tight, because if you flex the scales onto the tang, once that epoxy dries, if the knife drops or something bad, then that epoxy can pop loose and the scale can sever from the knife. If you put it on there just nice and snug, leave that breathing room for the epoxy. That way you're not having anything torqued down, so there's no flex to be anticipated if something bad happens. So nice and snug. Now you can see the epoxy's coming around all the margins. So I'm going to come through, and up here, around the ricasso and the choil, that's where the Q-tips come in. I'm going to get those wet with acetone and mop all that up. Alright, so now that I'm at this point, we're done machining on it, so I'll go ahead and remove this tape. That way, if there's any epoxy that's kind of snug down around the edge of that tape, I can go ahead and mop it up while I'm here before it dries. Couple more rounds with the rag. Alright, then I'll position it to dry. I just want to put the tail down of it a little bit lower than the front of it. That way any leftover epoxy drips down towards the back where it's going to get ground off anyways, and it doesn't bleed its way up onto the blade. So it's up in clamps, it's glued up, it's going to sit there minimum of a few hours. I haven't read the manufacturer's recommendations in a long time, but I always leave it overnight just so that it can fully cure. And once it's fully cured, you take the clamps off and you're ready to go ahead and grind the handle and finish this knife up. Once again, thanks for joining us. If you haven't already, subscribed now. We're getting closer to the finish of this build. So after conclusion of this project, I will be launching into other instructional videos as requested. I've had several requests for others already. If you have anything particular you're wanting to see, shoot me an email and I'll make it happen for you. Thanks again. Have a good day.